My phone buzzed just as I stepped out of a late meeting, the kind where the office lights are dim except for the glow of screens still trying to solve problems that should have been handled hours earlier. I glanced at the notification, expecting something from Daniel asking if I was on my way home. Instead, I saw the Carter family thread flashing on my screen. I almost kept walking, almost, but the preview line stopped me cold. Lila had tagged Daniel, not me, and the message read like someone quietly striking a match in a room full of dry timber. I opened the thread. Lila had sent him a long text, broken into those short lines she thinks make her sound thoughtful. She wrote that she was worried about me, that I had been acting unstable, that I was hiding something dangerous, and that Daniel should consider whether staying with me was safe for him. Safe for him. The words sat on the screen like a slap. Before I could even process it, Patricia reacted with a heart emoji, as if Lila had just shared a cute baby photo instead of suggesting her eldest daughter might be a threat to her own husband. Dad stayed quiet, but the silence was its own kind of agreement. I waited to see if Daniel would jump in, but the typing indicator blinked on my end only. I could hear the elevator humming beside me. As I stood still in the empty hallway, my breath tightening in that quiet that feels personal somehow, I typed a short sentence saying I had seen the message and that I was heading home soon. I did not address the accusations. I did not ask why she felt the need to send them. I did not feed the fire she had tossed at my feet. Then I locked my phone and slipped it into my coat pocket, as if that could keep the message from sinking any deeper. Daniel was waiting in the kitchen when I walked in. He looked up from the mug in his hands, studying me the way he does when he is trying to choose his words carefully. He asked if I had eaten, and I told him no. He hesitated before telling me about the conversation he had with Lila earlier in the week. She had pulled him aside after a family dinner, speaking in a low voice, asking if he felt safe with me, hinting at things she claimed I had done when I was overwhelmed. He said it made no sense to him then, but now seeing the message, it felt deliberate. He paused before admitting that something about her tone had unsettled him, not because he believed her, but because it felt rehearsed, practiced. I could feel a dull ache building behind my ribs, that familiar mix of anger and disappointment that only family seems capable of producing at the exact same time. I leaned against the counter, letting the cold stone steady me. I asked Daniel what exactly she had said, and he recounted it slowly, apologetically, as if the words were stains he wished he could scrub off. I listened without interrupting, letting each sentence mark the pattern I had known all along but never wanted to name. Lila had always been this way, always looking for a crack to widen, always certain that if she pressed hard enough the world would bend the way she wanted. Still, hearing her drag Daniel into it crossed a line I did not know she had the nerve to approach. Daniel set his mug down and told me he had started to feel that this was not about me at all. He said it felt like Lila wanted him on her side for a reason that had nothing to do with concern. Then he told me he planned to record any future conversations with her, not because he needed proof for himself, but because he felt she was building a narrative around me. He wanted something tangible to hold against whatever story she might try next. I stared at him for a long moment, surprised by his clarity. Daniel is not confrontational by nature, but he understands patterns better than most. He said he felt like she was circling something and he did not want to be unprepared when she struck again. I walked to the sink and let the faucet run a moment, watching the thin stream of water swirl down the drain as if it could carry away the tension of the night. The house felt heavy, like the air had thickened with everything that had not been said. I asked Daniel if he believed any part of what she wrote. He stepped toward me without answering right away, placing his hand on my shoulder. He said he knew me, all of me, even the parts I tried to control on my hardest days. He said the message did not worry him about me. It worried him about her. Something about the way he said it settled my breath, even as my mind kept replaying that same line from the message, the part about him being safer without me. We sat at the table with the overhead light casting a soft glow over the room. Daniel talked about how Lila always acted as if she knew what was best for everyone, and how her need to control situations tended to surface whenever she felt her own life slipping sideways. I thought back on the moments she had inserted herself into my relationships, the way Patricia excused it as concern, the way Dad avoided the subject altogether. It struck me suddenly that this moment in my kitchen was not the start of something, but the continuation of something old. Something I had not wanted to examine too closely before. A quiet moment passed before Daniel told me one more thing. He said Lila had asked him directly if he trusted me, and that she seemed disappointed when he said yes, without hesitation. He said her face had tightened as if his answer had disrupted something she had planned. I could feel the edges of this puzzle beginning to align, though I did not yet understand what the completed picture would show. The truth did not feel far away, just out of reach, waiting for the right pressure to reveal itself. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the distant lights of the neighborhood. They flickered gently against the dark sky, reminders of the private worlds behind each glowing square. Daniel remained silent behind me, giving me space to absorb the weight of what the night had dropped at our feet. I felt a steadiness forming in my chest, not anger and not fear, but a solid resolve shaped by years of watching Lila test boundary after boundary. She had stepped onto ground she did not understand this time. She had pressed into a corner of my life she could not twist to her advantage, not with the same careless confidence she used on everyone else. I finally turned back to Daniel. I told him I did not know yet what Lila was trying to accomplish, but I knew it was not for my benefit. He nodded, waiting. I took a breath and said that whatever came next, we would handle it together. He reached for my hand and held it, not tightly, but with a kind of certainty that made the tension in my shoulders ease for the first time since I saw her message. The night felt quieter then, as if something had shifted between us, something stronger than whatever accusation Lila had hoped would take root. We turned off the lights and headed upstairs, both of us carrying the same unspoken understanding. The next move would not come from us, and somehow, that made it easier to breathe. I woke the next morning with the feeling that something heavy had settled inside my chest. Not painful exactly, but dense enough that it shaped the way I moved through the house. Daniel had already left for an early meeting, and the silence made the rooms feel larger than usual. I stood in the kitchen, letting the kettle warm on the stove while sunlight crept across the counter. It should have felt peaceful, but my mind kept circling places it had tried to avoid for years, places with shadows that looked a lot like childhood. I carried my mug to the dining table and sat down, staring at the familiar grain of the wood. The table had belonged to my mother once, back when I was a teenager still living in our house outside Portland. She had given it to me when Daniel and I bought this home 8 years ago. A sentimental gesture, she said. But when I looked at it now, I remembered arguments whispered late at night. I remembered my own teenage frustration as I tried to understand why, no matter how well I did in school or how hard I tried to make her proud, she always softened toward Lila first. Lila, even the name pulled something sharp through my memory. She had always carried a brightness that drew people in. She knew how to charm adults, how to make teachers laugh, how to slip into the center of any room as if there were a spotlight waiting for her. She was clever, but not in the way that required work or discipline. She had a disarming sweetness until she felt threatened. And then the sweetness turned quick, sharp, and cutting, like a blade hidden in satin. When we were young, she would sit on the edge of my bed late at night and ask about the boy I had a crush on or about my plans for after graduation. At the time, I believed she wanted to be close. It was only years later that I understood she had been collecting information, picking pieces of my life she could hold like small stones, ready to toss in to ripple out whenever she needed to feel powerful again. Back then, Patricia always said Lila asked so many questions because she admired me. That was easier to swallow than the truth. As the kettle clicked off behind me, I remembered one night in particular. I was 17 and had just started seeing a boy named Caleb who lived 2 streets over. It was the first time in my life that someone looked at me with real interest. I felt seen in a way I had not known how to feel before. I told Lila about him, nervous but happy, expecting the gentle teasing she usually offered. Instead, she sat very still for a moment before asking if I trusted him. She said she had heard from someone at school that he was only interested in me because my grades were high and he wanted help with college applications. I had felt my stomach drop. She said it so kindly that I believed her. The next day I avoided Caleb and eventually pulled away completely. Years later, long after I moved to Seattle and started my career, I learned from Margaret that Lila had told him that I was planning to leave Oregon the moment I graduated, that he should protect himself from getting attached. He had believed her too. When Margaret told me, she looked almost guilty. as if she wished she had shared it sooner, but she said I had been too young then, too vulnerable to hear it. I took a sip of tea and let the warmth settle in my throat. Lila had never stopped interfering. Even after I married Daniel, she found ways to slip her influence between us, always under the cover of concern. She would tell Daniel that I hid stress poorly, or that I worked too hard, or that he needed to watch for signs of burnout. They were comments disguised as care, designed to make him study me instead of trust me. He never let those suggestions go far, but I could feel the way they tried to settle like dust into the corners of our marriage. A soft knock sounded at the door, breaking my thoughts. I wiped my hands on a towel and walked through the entryway. When I opened the door, Margaret stood there in her usual quilted coat, her cheeks flushed from the morning air. She lived only a few streets over, and she had made a habit of checking in on me since she moved to Seattle after her husband passed away. She knew my family better than anyone else in this town, and she knew when something weighed on me. She stepped inside without waiting for me to invite her. She had known me too long to need permission for that. I handed her a cup of tea, and she sat at the table, peering at me with those steady eyes that always seemed to see more than I said aloud. "You look troubled," she said softly. "Is it your family again?" I sat across from her and nodded, explaining the message from Lila and the way Daniel had reacted. Margaret listened without interrupting, her fingers curled around her mug, her expression tightening in quiet disapproval as I detailed everything. When I finished, she sighed, a long, tired sound that seemed to come from a place far older than the moment. "I have seen that girl tear down every bit of joy you ever tried to build," she said. "She has a way of convincing people she is protecting them from you, when the truth is she is protecting herself from being forgotten." She went quiet a moment, then added, "I always told myself she would grow out of it, but some people only grow deeper into their habits." I felt something shift in me, hearing her say that. Not sadness exactly, more like recognition. Patricia had always excused Lila's behavior, chalking it up to sensitivity, or stress, or youth. But youth had long since passed and the patterns had stayed. Margaret lifted her mug and looked at me over the rim, waiting. "There was a moment in high school," she continued, "when Lila came to my door crying. She claimed you had pushed her away after she tried to help you with a boy. But I knew even then that it was not the full story. She wanted to be the center of your parents' world, and she still wants to be, even now." I leaned back in my chair, letting her words settle. There was something grounding in hearing someone else articulate so clearly what I had only felt in pieces. It gave shape to memories that had always felt blurry and difficult to hold. Daniel called just then. His voice was calm when I answered, but I could tell he was choosing his words carefully again. He said he had been thinking about the conversation with Lila and Harper at the cafe, and that something about it bothered him more now that he had slept on it. He said it felt like they were setting the stage for something bigger, something that required distancing him from me. I told him I had been thinking the same thing. After I hung up, I realized my hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from certainty. The signs I had ignored for years were clearer now. This was not about a single message or a single conversation. This was about a lifetime of behavior crystallizing into something deliberate. Margaret reached gently across the table and touched my wrist. "You will need to be careful," she said. "Not afraid, just careful. People who depend on manipulation do not walk away quietly when it stops working." I nodded, feeling both comforted and unsettled. She stood to leave, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. Before she walked out the door, she looked back at me with a firm expression. "Do not let her make you doubt yourself again." When the door closed behind her, I stood in the quiet house and felt the air shift in a way that told me the ground beneath everything had begun to move. I was not sure yet where it would lead, but I knew this was no longer something I could brush aside. The next turn would come soon, and I could feel myself bracing for it without meaning to. I stood in the quiet of the house a little longer, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a leaf blower somewhere down the street. The stillness pressed in around me until I finally reached for my keys and stepped outside, needing air that was not thick with memory. The morning was cool, the kind of crisp that wakes your lungs up. I walked slowly to my car, trying to let the rhythm of movement clear my head, but thoughts of Lila leaked through every opening. On the drive to the office, Daniel called again. He said Lila had texted him asking if he had time to meet for coffee that afternoon. that she wanted to follow up on what they had discussed earlier in the week. His voice was steady, but I could hear tension in the way he breathed between sentences. He said he was going to go. He wanted to hear what she would say when she thought he might be wavering. He reminded me he had his small recorder tucked inside his jacket pocket. He said he felt oddly calm about it now. I told him to be careful, then hung up and drove the rest of the way in silence. By noon, Daniel texted that he was heading to the cafe near the waterfront. I had a meeting scheduled, but my mind kept drifting back to him sitting across from Lila. I tried to focus on the spreadsheets glowing on my monitor. I studied projections, risk models, annual returns, the numbers that usually grounded me, but they washed past without sticking. Eventually, I closed my laptop and let my elbows rest on the desk. My heartbeat felt too loud. The afternoon sun broke through the clouds as I stepped into the hallway. I had told myself not to check my phone, but of course I did anyway. Nothing yet. I walked downstairs to get some air on the plaza outside the building. People hurried in and out of the lobby, briefcases swinging, phones buzzing, shoes clicking against polished stone. It brought me back to myself a bit, reminded me I could still function in the world, even when the ground under me felt uncertain. At 2:30, Daniel finally called. His voice sounded tired but clear. He said he had met Lila at the cafe. She had arrived with that bright expression she uses when she thinks she has someone exactly where she wants them. She had leaned forward and said she had been thinking a lot about his marriage, and that she feared he was ignoring signs that could hurt him later. She said I had been overwhelmed, that maybe I was not as stable as he believed, that she had noticed how much pressure my job put on me and she worried I could snap. Daniel said he let her talk. He said she seemed to be choosing her words carefully, as if she had rehearsed them in her car before coming in. She kept circling around the idea that I was not quite myself lately, that I might have secrets I had not told him. He said she spoke slowly, offering concern, but her eyes kept watching him for reaction, waiting to see if he would absorb her story or push back. Then Harper showed up. Daniel said she walked in like she had been waiting outside for her cue. She slid into the booth and took over the conversation without missing a beat. She told Daniel she had been uneasy about me for months, said she had worried about my financial behavior, that she thought I might be hiding debts. Daniel told me that he had kept his face still, letting her speak. But when she said she had tried to check my accounts, he had felt something inside him go rigid. I listened to him recount it, feeling heat rise behind my eyes. He said she claimed she did it because she wanted to protect him, to make sure I was not dragging him into something unstable. He said he noticed Lila watching Harper while she spoke, almost proud of her performance. He said the two of them moved like a pair who had rehearsed the scene. That was the part that chilled me. I had imagined manipulation, but not partnership, not coordination. Daniel said he had asked one simple question. He asked them why they believed they had the right to involve themselves so deeply in our marriage. He said Lila had hesitated then, and that Harper jumped in quickly, insisting it was out of love. It was the kind of love that preys, the kind that suffocates, the kind that builds stories out of nothing and tries to force the world to rearrange itself to match. He told me he let the conversation run long enough to get what he needed. Then he stood, thanked them for meeting, and left. He said their faces looked surprised, as if they had expected him to be grateful for their concern. He said the sound of their voices, the cadence, the false worry, all of it was caught clearly on the recorder. When he finished recounting everything, he fell quiet. I sat on a stone bench outside the building listening to the murmur of traffic around me. A breeze lifted my hair slightly. I felt both exposed and steadied at the same time. At least now the truth was not a shapeless instinct. It had form, it had words, it had a timestamp. After work, I drove home with the windows cracked. The sky above Seattle was streaked with pale blue and soft gold. It looked calm, despite the tension settling deeper into my bones. Daniel was already in the living room when I arrived. He was sitting on the edge of the couch, leaning forward as if he had been waiting for me. He handed me the small silver recorder and told me I should listen. I sat down and pressed play. The recording opened with the sound of chairs shifting and a bit of background noise from the cafe. Lila's voice followed, gentle and measured at first, speaking as if she were reading lines meant to show compassion. She sounded concerned, but not genuinely. There was a faint tremble, the kind that comes from wanting to appear like the reasonable one in the conversation. Then Harper's voice layered in, smooth but tight, like someone trying hard to keep the edges hidden. They spoke about me as if I were not a person, but an unstable element that needed to be contained. They implied things. They guessed at things. They shaped a version of me that bore no resemblance to the truth. Then came the turn. Harper mentioned trying to access my accounts, said she had tried more than once, that she felt justified because she believed I was hiding something that might affect Daniel. My stomach clenched hearing it, the casualness, the entitlement, the certainty that she could cross a boundary because she believed it served some higher goal she had invented. When the recording ended, I sat still for a moment, feeling the weight of their words settle deep. Daniel told me he was sorry I had to hear it, but believed I needed to know what they were doing. He looked at me with a steadiness that made me feel both grounded and furious. Not at him, at them, at all the years they had practiced these patterns and been praised for their intentions. I thanked him and stood, walking into the kitchen to pour a glass of water. My hands shook just a little as I set the glass down. I realized I was not afraid of the truth anymore. I was angry in a clean and focused way. I was tired of shrinking myself to keep the peace. I was tired of pretending the past had not shaped the present. Daniel came to stand beside me. He did not touch me or try to offer comfort. He simply waited, giving me the space to feel whatever rose to the surface. I told him I needed time to think. He nodded and said he understood. We stayed there in silence for a while, the evening light dimming around us, the house settling into that quiet that always comes before something shifts for good. I walked toward the hallway a moment later, knowing the next step was already forming, even if I had not named it yet. The recorder sat on the counter behind me, small and unassuming, but holding everything I needed to see the truth clearly for the first time. I walked down the hall and into the bedroom, needing a moment to steady myself before facing whatever waited outside the walls of my own home. The sun had gone down an hour earlier, and the neighborhood was quiet in that way Seattle often is on weeknights, soft and subdued, as if everyone was trying not to disturb anyone else. I sat on the edge of the bed for a while, letting the weight of the recording settle into a place I could name: anger, disappointment, a strange kind of clarity. It all pressed into me at once. Eventually, I pushed myself up and returned to the living room. Daniel had drifted upstairs to shower, leaving the house quiet again. I stepped into the kitchen to refill my water and caught a glimpse of something through the side window near the door. It took a second for my eyes to adjust. A small envelope sat on the front step, nearly blending into the concrete. I felt a twinge of unease. We were not expecting packages. No one had texted, and the timing was too sharp after everything that had just happened. I opened the door, the chill of the evening brushing my skin as I stooped to pick up the envelope. It was heavier than it looked, thick paper, sealed neatly, no return address. Only my name typed on a small white label, not handwritten, not personal, intentionally neutral. I glanced toward the driveway, then the street. Nothing moved except a sprinkler across the road ticking faintly in the dark. I locked the door behind me and carried the envelope to the kitchen table. For a long moment, I just looked at it under the warm overhead light. Something about it felt deliberate in a way I did not like or fully understand. I slipped a finger under the seal and opened it. A stack of documents slid out with a soft thud. They were clipped neatly together with a black binder clip. The first page had a set of numbers across the top, along with Harper's full legal name. My stomach tightened before I even started reading. The pages were credit reports, loan applications, bank statements, notices of delinquency, letters from financial institutions. I skimmed quickly at first, then slowed as the pattern revealed itself more clearly. The earliest document was from 2014 in Bend, Oregon. The most recent was dated 6 months ago. Several accounts had been opened using addresses connected to Lila or Harper, and one address I knew too well. It was the Portland apartment I had leased in 2016 and let Lila use when she said she needed a place to reset her life. My pulse thudded as I examined the form. That apartment had been used as a primary residence on at least 2 loan applications filed under Harper's name. She had submitted statements referencing employment she never had and income she could not have earned. The debts had gone unpaid and rolled over into collections. I flipped through the pages, each one worse than the last. It was a trail of carelessness and calculated choices, layered over years. Then the next page made me sit straighter. My name appeared in the corner, not as the account holder, but as a supposed guarantor on a loan. The signature was not mine. The handwriting was nothing like mine. Someone had used my identity. It was not a large loan, but it was enough to leave a mark, enough to cause problems if someone looked too deeply, enough to explain why Harper had tried to access my accounts. She was checking for exposure. She was checking to see if I had noticed. I had not, until now. I pushed the stack away and leaned back, letting the air leave my lungs slowly. I did not recognize the initials typed at the bottom of the envelope. R.W. It did not tell me who the sender was, but the precision of the documents made it clear that whoever sent this wanted me to know exactly what Harper had done. They wanted me to understand the depth of her behavior, not just the pieces she had shown Daniel at the cafe. I heard footsteps coming down the stairs and looked up as Daniel entered the room, hair damp, his expression softening as he saw the papers in front of me. He asked what they were. I told him he needed to see for himself. He pulled out a chair and sat, taking the first few pages from the stack. His brow tightened as he read. He stopped at the page with my forged signature. He whispered something under his breath, something sharp, almost a growl, before he caught himself. He glanced at me, anger and disbelief flickering across his face. I told him I had found the envelope outside less than 15 minutes earlier and had no idea who sent it. We sat there in silence for a moment, both of us absorbing the sense that our world had tilted again. Not dramatically, not loudly, but certainly and without permission. Daniel handed me the recorder. He said he had been thinking about the ending of the conversation with Lila and Harper, the way they seemed to shift once they realized he was not buying into their warnings. He said there had been a moment, just before he stood to leave, when Harper told Lila not to worry, because they had other ways to get through to me. He said it quietly, as if saying it louder might make it more dangerous. I pressed play on the recorder again, but only for the last few moments. The recording crackled softly. Lila sounded frustrated, her voice thinner now, straining to hold control. Harper's voice followed, low but sharp, saying something about how people eventually see what they need to see. It was not a threat exactly, but it was too close to one for comfort. I turned off the recorder and placed it beside the documents. My mind began stitching pieces together more quickly than I expected. The cafe meeting, the attempt to access my accounts, the message about my marriage, the forged signature, the apartment in Portland, the sudden envelope placed on my doorstep. None of it was random. None of it was impulsive. This was a pattern. This was behavior shaped over time and sharpened by desperation. Daniel asked me what I thought we should do next. I stared at the papers a moment longer before answering. I told him this had gone too far to handle casually. It needed to be addressed. It needed to be documented. It needed to be treated as the serious violation it was. I said I planned to call Sophia in the morning. Daniel nodded immediately. He did not argue, did not try to calm me or soften the situation. He agreed because he understood. I gathered the papers back into a stack and clipped them together again, careful and deliberate. The weight of them felt heavier than before. I walked them into my home office and placed them on the desk, right beside the recorder, two small objects holding the truth of the last few days, two small objects that would change the course of whatever came next. When I returned to the kitchen, Daniel was leaning on the counter, staring at the floor, deep in thought. He looked up as I approached and asked if I was all right. I told him I did not know yet, but I felt steadier with the truth in front of me than I had with the uncertainty. He reached for my hand again, the way he had the night before, and for a moment everything felt quiet and solid. I knew the stillness would not last. There was more coming, and for the first time, I felt prepared to meet it. Morning light seeped through the blinds long before I was ready to face it. I lay still for a moment, listening to the faint sounds of the house settling, trying to gather myself. I knew the day ahead would require a steadiness I did not yet feel, but I also knew I had run out of places to set these truths aside. When I finally pushed myself out of bed, the air held that quiet hush that comes before a storm, not loud or threatening, just heavy with direction. Daniel was already downstairs, sitting at the end of the dining table with his coffee untouched. He lifted his eyes when I entered but did not speak right away. I sat across from him and he reached for my hand in a way that told me he had been waiting for me to wake up before he let his thoughts move forward. He asked if I was ready to call Sophia. I nodded. He said he would stay close if I needed anything. His steadiness had always been one of the first things that drew me to him, and in that moment it felt like solid ground. By 8 a.m., I was in my home office with the stack of documents laid out neatly and the recorder beside them. I dialed Sophia's number. She answered with the measured warmth she always used, the kind that made you feel like nothing you were about to say would rattle her. I told her I had received new information and described the envelope, the forged signature, the apartment connection, the timeline of the documents. She did not interrupt, only asked for details where needed, her tone tightening whenever I mentioned anything that pointed toward identity fraud. When I finished, she told me to bring everything to her office by mid-morning. She wanted to look over it before deciding the next steps. She explained that depending on how deep Harper's actions went, this could involve both state and possibly federal violations. Hearing those words made something harden inside me. Not fear, not shock, just confirmation of the instinct I had been trying not to trust for too long. I printed Daniel's transcript of the recording and placed it on top of the stack. Before I closed the folder, I hesitated. There was one page that still made my hands tense, the loan application with my forged signature. I touched the edge of it lightly, feeling anger flare and settle at the same time. It was no longer just manipulation. It was no longer just emotional sabotage. It was a crime. And whoever RW was, they had made sure I knew it clearly. I drove to Sophia's office downtown, the morning traffic moving slow along the wet pavement. The sky was gray, but the kind of gray that felt honest, not bleak. When I walked into her building, she greeted me in the lobby and led me to a private conference room. She spread the documents out across the table, scanning through each one with detailed precision. When she reached the page with my forged signature, she sighed softly and pressed her fingers against her forehead. She told me she had worked cases before where relatives forged signatures to access credit, and it almost always led to deeper issues. She asked if I had ever given Harper or Lila any access to my personal information. I told her no. She nodded without looking up. I could see her mind working quickly through legal steps and possible outcomes. Then she asked something I had not expected. She asked if anyone else knew about this envelope besides Daniel. I told her no. She said that was good. Sometimes the person who sends information like this has their own reasons for staying hidden, and letting it surface too early could complicate things. As she finished reviewing the last page, her phone buzzed softly on the table. She glanced at it, then at me, and excused herself to step outside. I stood up and walked toward the window that overlooked the street below. People hurried along the sidewalks with umbrellas and coffee cups, unaware of how drastically a life could shift in a single night. I wondered if Harper felt the ground shifting under her own choices. People who manipulate often believe the fallout will never reach them, as if consequences are something that only visit other houses, never their own. Sophia returned after a few minutes and told me Detective Hughes had just emailed her. He wanted to speak with me that afternoon. She explained that he had received reports about Harper from an anonymous source months earlier, but had not had enough evidence to pursue anything formal. She said my documents might change that. I felt a chill run through me. RW again, whoever they were. They had been tracking Harper long before she tried to wedge herself into my marriage. I drove home with the folder resting in the passenger seat. The rain had stopped by then, and the clouds were beginning to thin. Daniel was waiting in the living room when I walked in. He asked how the meeting had gone, and I told him everything. He listened the way he always did, with quiet focus. He asked if I felt any clearer now. I told him clarity was not the problem anymore. I knew exactly what had happened. The issue now was deciding how to address it in a way that protected both of us, without letting the situation escalate in dangerous directions. We moved into the kitchen, and I poured a glass of water as Daniel leaned back against the counter. He said he had gone through our shared accounts again and noticed at least 2 attempts to log into one of our older financial profiles. He showed me the timestamps on his phone. The attempts matched days I had been traveling for work earlier in the month. I felt something twist inside me. I remembered Lila asking about my travel schedule during a casual conversation, claiming she wanted to know when I and Daniel would be free for dinner. I had not thought anything of it at the time, but now it clicked into place. Harper had known when the house was empty. She had known when I would be unreachable. She had timed her attempts. I sat down at the table, feeling the weight of that realization. The idea that she had planned this with intention made the air feel colder. Daniel sat beside me and said we would go through every account one by one until everything was secured. He also said he had changed the passwords on the devices that connected to our home network. For a long moment, we sat quietly, the house holding its breath with us. Then a soft vibration sounded from my phone. It was an email, not from Sophia, not from the detective. From an address I did not recognize. The subject line read simply, "A warning you need." I opened it slowly. The message was brief, no more than 2 lines. It said that Harper had been involved in similar behavior with others, that if I wanted to understand the full picture, I should not confront her directly. There was no name signed at the bottom, only the initials R.W. Daniel leaned over to read. He looked at me with a question in his eyes, but neither of us said anything. The message felt less like a threat and more like a reminder that whatever was unraveling had started long before it reached my front door. I set the phone down and stared at the documents on the table again. I could feel something in me shifting, moving from defense to a kind of measured resolve. I knew I could not step back now. A line had been crossed, and not accidentally. I stood and looked toward the stairs, needing a moment alone to think. Daniel asked if I wanted him to join me. I told him I would call for him if I did. He nodded and stayed seated, watching me with a steadiness that made it easier to breathe. In the quiet of the hallway, I began to realize that the next steps would not just determine how we handled Harper and Lila. They would determine how I reclaimed the parts of my life they had tried to twist. And as unsettling as the truth was, it gave me something solid to stand on at last. I walked into the bedroom and closed the door behind me, letting the quiet settle into the space before I allowed myself to think about what needed to happen next. The conversation with Sophia, the message from the detective, the email from R.W., all of it layered in my mind like pages of a book I had been forced to read too quickly. But there was one thing I had been avoiding since this began. One conversation I knew I could not postpone any longer. I needed to see my parents. I needed to hear what they believed and what they were willing to ignore. The next morning, I drove down to Portland. The sky shifted between gray and pale blue as I left Seattle behind. The road long enough to give me too much time with my own thoughts. Daniel had wanted to come with me, but I told him I needed to do this alone. He did not argue, though I could tell he wanted to. When I pulled into my parents' driveway, I sat for a moment in the car, watching the curtains move slightly in the front window. Someone had seen me arrive. I took a breath and stepped out. Patricia opened the door before I reached it. Her expression was that familiar, controlled smile she used whenever something unsettled her, but she wanted to pretend otherwise. She hugged me briefly and stepped back, looking me over in a way that felt more like assessment than affection. She said she was glad I came, that things had been tense in the family thread and she hoped we could talk calmly. She said the word calmly too pointedly, as if she thought I might come in shouting. Dad was sitting in his usual chair when I walked into the living room. He gave me a quiet nod, but nothing more. The silence stretched for several seconds before Patricia motioned toward the couch. I sat. She stayed standing. She asked if I understood that Lila had only been trying to help. She asked if I had considered that maybe stress had made me sensitive to good intentions. She asked if I had seen how worried Lila had been, how shaken she was after reaching out to Daniel. She asked all of it in a tone that made her sound like she was gently guiding a confused child back into place. I let her finish. Then I told her that I had heard the recording. Dad looked up sharply at that. Patricia froze for a moment and asked what recording. I told her Daniel had met with Lila and Harper at a cafe and recorded the entire conversation. I said the recording made it clear they were not worried about me. They were constructing a story. They were trying to push Daniel away from me. They were not acting with compassion. They were acting with intention. Patricia shook her head quickly and said, Lila would never sabotage my marriage. She insisted Lila was trying to warn Daniel. She insisted that as my sister, she had every right to express concern. I told her she had crossed a line. Dad cleared his throat but said nothing. I took my phone from my purse and played a short portion of the recording, the one where Lila said Daniel would be better off without me, the one where she said I was too strong-willed to manage, the one where Harper added that Daniel needed to prepare for the fallout once he realized who I really was. The words filled the room and Patricia's face drained of color. She said nothing at first. Dad looked stunned. A long silence stretched between us until Patricia finally whispered that there had to be context, that maybe they were speaking hypothetically. I told her she was wrong. I told her this was not new behavior, it was a pattern, and I reminded her of all the moments in my childhood and early adulthood when Lila had interfered. Moments she dismissed as sisters being sisters. Patricia sat down slowly, as if the truth had weight. Dad leaned back in his chair and rubbed his hands together. He asked how long I had known something like this was happening. I told him the truth. I had known pieces of it for years, but had not understood the shape until now. There was a knock at the open doorway. It was Margaret. She stepped into the living room with a soft expression, greeting my parents in that warm way she always used, then looked at me and asked if everything was all right. I told her I had come to talk to them about the situation with Lila. She nodded as if the moment was expected. Margaret sat beside me and said she had known for a long time that Lila struggled with jealousy. She said she had wanted to stay quiet out of respect for family boundaries, but now felt silence was harmful. Then she told my parents what she had told me years earlier. She reminded them of the time Lila sabotaged my relationship with a boy from high school by feeding him lies. She spoke gently, not accusing, just stating what happened. Patricia's face tightened with something complicated, something that looked like denial slipping out of her grip. Dad finally asked how this connected to what was happening now. I told him everything, the forged signature, the loan applications, the attempts to access my accounts, the message to Daniel, the coordination between Lila and Harper, and the documents I had given to Sophia that morning. He listened without interrupting, but his eyes went distant, as if he were cataloging every memory he had of his daughters and weighing them against what I was saying. When I finished, neither of my parents spoke for a long time. The air felt suspended, thick with what they wanted to deny and what they could no longer ignore. Patricia eventually whispered that Lila must be under a tremendous amount of pressure, that sometimes people make mistakes when they feel cornered. I asked her if she understood that this was not a mistake. It was a series of choices. She looked away. I told them I was ending my financial support to Lila, the apartment in Portland, the occasional payments I quietly covered, all of it. Dad nodded, almost relieved. Patricia looked up sharply and said that this would diminish the family bond. I said the bond had already been diminished by years of excuses and by the silence they offered whenever Lila hurt me. Dad opened his mouth but stopped, closing it again. He seemed to recognize there was nothing he could say that would not break more than it mended. I stood then, unable to sit in the weight of that room any longer. Margaret rose with me, sensing the moment. As I walked toward the door, Patricia reached for my arm lightly and said she hoped I would not shut them out as well. I did not know how to answer. I told her I needed time. She let her hand fall. Outside, the air was cool and carried the scent of damp earth. Margaret walked with me to my car. She touched my arm gently and said she was proud of me. I felt my eyes sting, not from sadness, but from the strange release of finally saying aloud what I had kept buried for too long. When I got into the car and closed the door, the house looked smaller than I remembered, as if the truth had shrunk it. I started the engine and let the radio play softly, not listening to the words, just letting the sound fill the space. I drove down the street slowly, watching the familiar sidewalks pass by, each one holding pieces of a childhood I no longer recognized in the same way. By the time I reached the highway back to Seattle, the sky had shifted again, dimming into the soft blue of late afternoon. The miles stretched ahead of me, and I let the rhythm of the drive settle my breath. I knew the conversation with my parents had changed something permanent, something that could not be undone no matter how they tried to frame it later. As the road carried me north, I felt the hard edge of resolve settle deeper into place. Lila and Harper had taken this further than I ever imagined they would. But now I understood exactly what I was dealing with. And what needed to happen next was no longer a question. I crossed back into Washington just as the sun slipped behind a bank of clouds, leaving the sky a muted gray that matched the heaviness in my chest. The drive had drained me more than I expected. By the time I pulled into our driveway, I felt the kind of tired that settles deep in the bones, the kind that comes from holding yourself upright through conversations that never should have been necessary in the first place. When I stepped inside, the house was warm and quiet, the lights low, and Daniel was in the kitchen rinsing a plate. He looked up and studied me for a moment before turning off the faucet. He asked how it went. I told him the truth in the simplest way I could. I said it was done. I said they knew everything now. He did not press for more. He knew I needed time to let the morning settle before I picked up the pieces of what came next. He wrapped his arms around me, and for the first time all day my shoulders loosened. We ate dinner in relative silence, the soft clinking of silverware the only sound in the room. My mind kept drifting back to my parents' faces, the disbelief, the excuses, the quiet acknowledgement beneath their struggle to defend what could not be defended. By the time I set my fork down, I felt something inside me shift again. Not anger, not grief, more like readiness, a still kind of calm. Later that night, after we cleaned up, I walked into the living room to turn off the lights. I had just reached for the switch when I noticed movement through the small side window facing the driveway. Daniel stepped beside me. Narrowing his eyes slightly, two figures stood near the trunk of our car, their faces turned toward the house. My breath caught before my mind even registered what my eyes already knew. It was Lila and Harper. Before I could react, Daniel moved ahead of me. He opened the front door partway and called out, asking what they were doing there. His voice carried a firm steadiness I had not always seen in him, and I felt something warm in my chest, even in the tension of the moment. Lila stepped forward first, her expression tight and frantic. She said she needed to talk, said she had been calling our phones all afternoon, said she deserved a chance to explain. Harper hovered behind her, eyes darting toward the street like someone expecting to be followed. Something jittery ran beneath her movements, something that hinted at fear rather than guilt. Daniel told them we would not talk outside. He stepped back and let them approach the porch. I stayed behind him, my pulse thudding. When they reached the top step, Harper blurted out that she had gotten a notice from the state, that investigators were asking questions about old accounts and addresses. She said someone had reported her. She looked directly at me when she said it, as if daring me to confirm it. I kept my voice steady. I told her investigators ask questions when there is something to investigate. She flinched as if the truth itself had weight. Lila turned sharply toward her, then back toward me, eyes shining with a mix of accusation and something like desperation. She asked if I understood that this was ruining their lives. She said families should protect one another, not throw each other into legal trouble. The words struck me with a kind of sick familiarity. That was always her argument. The claim that loyalty meant silence, that love meant accepting harm, that family meant turning away from truth. I felt a strange calm settle over me. I told her I had protected her for years. I told her I had looked away from too many things already. I said I was done doing that. Harper stepped forward then, her voice shaking. She said she never meant for things to get this far. She said she only did what she did because she had been drowning in debt and did not know where else to turn. She said she had panicked. She said she regretted trying to access my accounts. She said it was all a misunderstanding, every word tangled together with the frantic rhythm of someone who still hoped the right combination of excuses could pull everything back into place. Daniel stood between us, his presence a quiet barrier. He asked her directly if she had forged my signature. She froze. For a moment she looked at him, then at me and then at the ground. She did not answer, and in that silence, the truth solidified. Lila snapped at her, asking why she had not told her everything. Her voice cracked, the panic rising. She insisted she had only wanted to keep the family safe. She insisted she had thought Harper was being responsible. Harper cut her off with a harsh whisper that they needed to stick together, that blaming each other would only make things worse. They argued in hushed tones on the porch, as if forgetting for a moment that Daniel and I were standing right there. Watching them fight felt surreal. It was as if their entire partnership had been held together by tension. And now that the pressure had shifted, they were collapsing inward. Lila turned back to me with tears streaking her face. She said she felt cornered. She said she was afraid of what would happen. She said she never expected me to go so far. I stepped forward then, not close enough to touch, but close enough that she could not mistake my clarity. I told her I had not gone anywhere she had not already pushed me. I reminded her of the message to Daniel, the lies she had tried to plant, the manipulation she had practiced for years. I reminded her that she had crossed a line long before the investigators appeared. For a moment she stared at me without speaking. Her breathing was unsteady. She whispered that I was choosing Daniel over her, I felt a flicker of something old inside me, a distant ache from the years when she made me believe caring about myself was a betrayal of her. But I did not let it surface. I told her this had nothing to do with choosing anyone. It had to do with truth. It had to do with boundaries. It had to do with survival. Harper stepped closer again, but Daniel lifted a hand and told her she needed to stop. He said we were done talking. He said any further communication had to go through our attorney. His voice was steady enough that even Harper did not argue. I told them both to go home. I told them there was nothing more for us to discuss on our porch. They stood frozen for a moment before turning slowly and walking back down the driveway. Lila kept looking back as if hoping I would call after her, but I did not. The porch light cast long shadows across the yard as they reached their car. When they pulled away, the sound of the tires on the pavement felt like a chapter closing. Not gently, not cleanly, but closing all the same. Daniel stepped beside me and rested his hand on my back. Neither of us spoke as we went inside. My heart was still pounding, but underneath the adrenaline there was something quieter, a strange blend of sadness and relief. The house felt still, almost peaceful, as if the truth had finally cleared enough space to breathe again. I locked the door and stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle back into place. Something had shifted permanently, and for the first time, I was not afraid of what that meant. I turned off the porch light and let the darkness settle before walking deeper into the house, each step loosening the tension that had wound tight through my body. Sleep was slow to come that night. I lay awake listening to the soft rise and fall of Daniel's breathing, my mind replaying every word from the porch, every flicker of fear in Lila's eyes, every frantic whisper between her and Harper. But beneath the noise of memory, a quiet understanding began to take shape. They were unraveling, not because of me, because of the weight of their own choices finally catching up. Morning arrived pale and cool. I woke before the alarm and slipped out of bed, letting Daniel rest. In the kitchen, I poured myself coffee, holding the mug with both hands as steam curled upward. The house felt unusually still, as if waiting. I checked my phone. A notification from Sophia blinked on the screen. She had forwarded a set of documents from the investigator's office. I opened the email slowly, bracing myself. The message was brief. The state had officially begun interviews regarding the fraudulent accounts tied to Harper. There was also a request for updated contact information for the Portland apartment, including confirmation that I had been the sole leaseholder. I read the line twice. My chest tightened. The reality of legal procedures settling in always carried a different weight than suspicion alone. I forwarded the information to Daniel and set the phone down. As I took another sip of coffee, I realized the house no longer felt heavy with dread. It felt grounded. Daniel came downstairs a few minutes later and leaned on the counter beside me. I told him about the email from Sophia. He listened quietly, then nodded with the calm certainty he carried whenever a situation moved from chaos into structure. He said this was expected. He said consequences take their time, but they do arrive. I rested my hand on his and felt some of the lingering tension melt away. By late morning, I had driven to my office in Seattle. The building's tall glass exterior reflected clouds drifting overhead. And for a moment I stood outside, collecting myself before stepping through the rotating doors. Inside, the hum of productivity filled the lobby. It was strangely comforting, a reminder that my life had shape beyond the turmoil of family. My assistant left a stack of documents on my desk, along with a note that Detective Hughes had called and asked to confirm an appointment for the following week. The precision of it reassured me. This was no longer a private family crisis. There were official channels now, guardrails that would keep the truth from slipping into shadows. I spent the next few hours reviewing quarterly reports and answering emails, grateful for the focus. At one point, I stepped into a meeting, and the structured conversation felt like a welcome reprieve from the emotional chaos of the past days. Yet even as I spoke, a faint vibration pulsed through my phone inside my blazer pocket. 3 missed calls, all from my father. I excused myself when the meeting ended and stepped into the quiet hallway. I leaned against the wall and called him back. He answered on the first ring, his voice strained. He said my mother had received a letter that morning addressed to her and Lila, It requested verification of their knowledge of certain loan applications tied to their home address. He sounded shaken, not angry, not defensive, just exhausted. He asked how this all began. I told him the truth. I told him it began years ago. But the legal part began when someone mailed me evidence of identity fraud. He was quiet for a long moment and then said he wished he had listened differently when we were growing up. I felt something soften unexpectedly inside me. When we hung up, I returned to my office and sat for a moment, letting the quiet wash over me. I could feel a slow shift happening inside me, a recalibration. Something about knowing that accountability was finally moving outward, not inward, eased a pressure I had been carrying for years. That afternoon, an email popped up from the property management company overseeing the Portland apartment. They had processed the cancellation of my lease and notified the occupants of the deadline to vacate. I stared at the message. It was real now, tangible, a decision I had made fully and finally. I drove home early, needing the comfort of familiar walls and Daniel's presence more than I needed to stay late at the office. When I pulled into the driveway, Daniel was outside tidying the small garden bed by the walkway. He looked up as I got out of the car and wiped his hands on his jeans before meeting me halfway. He asked how the day went. I told him about the call from Dad, the letters being sent, the investigator appointment. He listened intently and then reached out to brush a piece of wind-blown hair from my cheek. He said he could tell something inside me had shifted. I told him I felt lighter, but also steadier, like I had planted my feet somewhere firm at last. We walked inside together. The house was warm and quiet again, the faint smell of the rosemary candle I had lit the night before still lingering in the air. I set my bag down and sank into the couch. Daniel sat beside me and rested his hand where my knee bent, looking at me the way he always did when he sensed I was carrying more than I admitted. Later that evening, as I went through the mail, I found a thin envelope addressed to me with no return address. My stomach tightened, but I opened it. Inside was a simple typed notice from the credit bureau confirming that my fraud alert and protective freeze had been activated. It was procedural, straightforward, completely unremarkable. Yet holding it felt like holding a small piece of safety I had not realized I needed. I set it aside just as my phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Margaret. She said she had heard from my parents and that they seemed shaken but calmer. She said she hoped I was doing all right. Her words wrapped around me like a soft blanket, grounding and kind. The rest of the night passed quietly. Daniel cooked a simple dinner, and we ate together in the soft light of the dining room. When the conversation drifted to lighter things, I felt my shoulders ease further. It was the first evening in weeks that did not feel like waiting for something to explode. After dinner, we walked out onto the back patio. The sky was fading into a deep blue, and the cool night air brushed against my skin. Daniel rested his arm around me, and we stood there in silence, both of us looking out over the yard as if it held the answers we had been searching for. I felt content in a way I had not expected, not because everything was resolved, not because the storm had passed, but because for the first time, the truth was no longer working against me. It was working with me. It was settling into place. When we finally went back inside, the house felt even quieter, but not empty. It felt like something new was forming between the broken pieces. Something clean, something honest. And I knew the last confrontation was coming soon. I woke the next morning with the sense that the air in the house had shifted again. Not with tension this time, but with an unmistakable awareness that something was coming to a close. The light outside was soft and calm, and for a moment I let myself breathe in that quiet before stepping out of bed. Daniel was already downstairs, the faint sound of coffee being poured drifting up the stairwell. When I joined him in the kitchen, he handed me a mug without a word. We stood there for a moment in an easy silence, the kind that grows only after a relationship has survived something heavy. He finally asked if I had heard anything new. I shook my head. Nothing from Sophia, nothing from the investigator, nothing from my parents, nothing from Lila and Harper. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a new message. It came from an unfamiliar email address, but the moment I opened it, I knew exactly who had sent it. R.W. The message contained a single attachment, a document scan. I opened it slowly, my pulse ticking up even as I tried to steady myself. The file was an old police report from 2017. A small business owner in Bend, Oregon, had filed a complaint after being defrauded during a consulting engagement. The handwriting on the form looked hurried, pained. The name of the person responsible was blacked out except for the first letter, a single H, but the details matched too closely to be coincidence. The pattern was the same: loan applications, fabricated income, financial manipulation, and then a sudden disappearance when the fallout came. I swallowed hard and scrolled down. At the bottom of the report was a note, typed in the same cool tone as the email. "She did this to me too. I thought you should know before she does it to someone else again." I stared at the words until they blurred slightly. It was not anger that rose in me, not even surprise. It was a kind of sad recognition. This was who Harper had been long before she crossed my path. This was not new behavior. It was a cycle. And someone out there had decided to break their silence so I would not become the next casualty. I forwarded the file to Sophia with a short explanation. She responded within minutes, asking me to send the document directly to Detective Hughes as well. I did. The moment I hit send, it felt like placing the final piece of a puzzle I had not known how to assemble weeks earlier. Daniel and I spent the rest of the afternoon in the living room, quietly sorting through some of the old paperwork we had meant to organize months ago. It felt grounding to do something ordinary. At one point he paused and looked at me with an expression I had not seen in a long time, something like pride mixed with relief. He asked if I felt different now than I did when this began. I said yes. I felt clearer, lighter, more certain of myself than I had in years. I told him I felt like I had walked through a doorway and left something behind. He nodded and squeezed my hand. Late that evening I received another email, this time from Sophia. She said the investigator had confirmed multiple inconsistencies in Harper's records and that formal proceedings had begun. She also said the Portland apartment case had been processed and the official documents were on file, protecting me from any liability tied to that address. My shoulders loosened in a way I had not realized they were still tight. A half hour later, my phone buzzed again, a text from Dad. He said he and Mom were staying out of everything from now on. He said they needed time to understand what they had looked away from for too long. He said he hoped I was taking care of myself. The words were simple, but something in them felt like a small act of repair. I replied that I hoped they were taking care of themselves too. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was something real. Daniel joined me on the couch and rested his arm gently around my shoulders. He asked if I thought everything was truly over. I told him that endings rarely arrive the way we expect. They do not always slam shut. Sometimes they close slowly, step by step, until one day you realize the door is no longer open behind you. I said I thought we had reached that point. He kissed my temple and said he was proud of me. The house felt warm again, not guarded, not tense, just ours. Later that night, I stepped outside onto the back patio. The sky above Seattle was wide and dark, dotted with faint starlight between drifting clouds. The air smelled clean, like rain was somewhere nearby but not yet ready to fall. I wrapped my arms around myself and closed my eyes for a moment, letting the quiet wash through me. I thought about everything that had unfolded, the twisted accusations, the manipulation, the forged signature, the recording that revealed more than words alone ever could. The envelope on my doorstep, the truth that had rippled outward until it touched every corner of my life. And then I thought about the boundaries I had rebuilt, the clarity I had reclaimed, and the peace that had begun to settle into the spaces they left behind. When I returned inside, Daniel was waiting for me at the bottom of the stairs. He smiled softly as I approached. I felt steady in a way I had not felt in years. Not because everything had been fixed, but because I finally understood what was mine to hold and what was never mine to carry. So much of my life had been shaped by keeping quiet to preserve the illusion of family harmony, but now I knew the truth. Harmony built on silence is not harmony at all. It is sacrifice. And boundaries are not cruelty. They are respect for yourself. As I walked upstairs, beside Daniel, I felt something inside me settle, like the last piece of a long, unsettled puzzle dropping into place. And that is where my story lands for now. If you have walked through anything like this, or felt the shift of your own boundaries forming again, I hope you will stay with me and share your thoughts. These stories matter because they remind us we are not alone. If this one stayed with you, let me know, and follow along so you do not miss the next chapter in this journey toward truth, resilience, and the kind of peace we all deserve.